Hello and welcome to the show that does not have a name because this is not a Q&A video. I'm your host, Panyo Basa. And I will say that this video that I'm going to embark upon here may have been inspired indirectly by a Q&A video because somebody in the comments to a YouTube video, possibly a Q&A, quoted a sutta in the Sutta Nipata saying that there is just one truth, not another. And then this morning, I just happened to have a copy of the Attica Wagga right here. And I opened it and I just opened the book right to that one verse that there is one truth, not another. And it's from the Viyuha Sutta. And so I'm going to give a little talk on both of the Viyuha Suttas, the lesser and the greater. But first, I suppose I should give a little intro to the Attica Wagga, which is here. And this is my own translation of it. And this book has a rather a spotty history. Um, you can see this is a Path Press edition, and it's got a typo right on the cover. See where here, English. The word English is spelled wrong. That's not my doing. That was the typesetter in the Netherlands or wherever it was that they set this. And the history of this translation of mine is back around 1997. I started writing a translation of the Atthakavagga because it was one of the main texts that inspired me to become a Buddhist monk. It was a profound text. It's kind of mind-blowing in certain respects. And I couldn't find a really good translation of it. I had a translation by K.R. Norman, but K.R. Norman of the Pali Text Society, he freely admits that he is not a Buddhist. He doesn't really even have much interest in Buddhism. He's just interested in the Pali language. He is a linguist, a philologist. And so, I mean, he gets the grammar right and everything, but he really doesn't understand what it is he's translating, and so he makes mistakes. And there are other translations, but I never really came across one that really satisfied me. So I set out to translate this thing myself, and it took a long time, partly because poetry is hard to translate to begin with, but also the Attica which is somewhat unusual for Buddhist texts, or might even say radically unusual. It's full of plays on words. It's full of puns and just words with multiple meanings, two or three meanings just packed into one word, which is really sophisticated. You know, you're saying more than one thing at the same time because it's pretty obvious, in many cases anyway, that it is deliberate. They're deliberately saying two or three things at the same time, which is like packing in information into this one word because you're saying more than one thing with this one word. So anyway, I translated this text. It took a long time, as I say. It was really a labor of love. It's the biggest Pali translation I've ever worked on. And I was in Burma at the time. I was a monk living in Burma. Partly, I spent a little bit of time in Japan when I was working on it too. But when I got to, I wanted to publish this thing for free distribution, and I had a supporter volunteer to pay for having a small edition published, and that would be this one, the Attica Wagga Pali with English translation, and it's all handwritten. I had to write the whole thing out by hand and just photocopy it because we took it to a publisher, like a book publisher in Mandalay, and I told them, you know, just copy this. I mean, just photocopy my handwriting. I wrote it out neatly, and they just ignored the instructions, which is kind of standard for Burma. It's like against Burmese tradition to follow instructions, and they did like a galley proof, and there was like 20 typos on each page. It was just a mess. So then I just said, no, just photocopy it and publish it. And so we got this. This is like the first edition, and there are a few copies in existence, not very many. Then I came back to America to visit my parents one time. This is, gosh, early 2000s, I suppose. And I had access to a computer for the first time pretty much ever. So I printed it up on a word processor, and we came up with the second edition, which is this, the Attakavagga Pali with English translation. And I wanted it small because I wanted this to be a book that you could just carry around in your pocket. You know, you could sit out in the forest or on top of a hill or something and just pull it out of your pocket and read it. That was the idea. I was even having these grandiose ideas of like waterproof paper, like some field guides, like bird watchers and so forth, have their books printed on like waterproof paper so they don't get wrecked in the rain. Um, and there's a few minor changes, but this is the second edition. And then there was a very brief, it was sort of like a beta or like a provisional third edition, which is this. And this one had a strange history in that um, shortly after I came back to America in 2011 and started up the nipapancha.org website, which is languishing. I haven't paid much attention to it over the past several years, I suppose. But there was a monk in England, I think. He was a European monk ordained in Great Britain, and he took a very great interest in what I was writing. He said it was probably not for beginners because it could cause doubt in beginners, but he wanted to see this thing published. And so he started getting to work on having this thing published. This was like the preliminary edition of it. And then they decided to go to Path Press with the typo, which is this one. And they had the thing printed out for free distribution. It was even sent out to the Ajahn Chah monasteries around the world. And then, because I really was kind of edgy, kind of a Buddhist shitlord, and I wrote some controversial stuff on my earlier blog that finally they just pulled out. They just said, no, we can't do this. And the publisher actually sent apology letters to all the Ajahn Chah monasteries, or at least some of them, apologizing for sending them boxes of this book for free distribution. So this one also really, I mean, it's just, it's like David Hume saying that his first book just fell dead-born from the press. It's kind of a similar thing. But as I say, the Attica Wagga is um, one of my favorite, probably my favorite part of the entire Pali Tipitaka. And I'm going to read two suttas with give some commentary afterwards. And they're both Viyuha suttas. And the Viyuha means something like tactical deployment. Like there was a science, like a military science of different army formations, and that was called Viyuha or Vyuha. And these two suttas are the lesser and the greater Viyuha suttas. So I translated them as the small discourse on tactical deployment and the large discourse on tactical deployment. K.R. Norman, cleverly, I think, called it the discourses on dispositions, because it's not really a military sutta. It's using a military term, but it's really about the nature of truth and like human psychology and its attempt to know the truth and so forth. So dispositions is nice, but it was already taken. And I wanted it to be more like the usual meaning of the word, so I called it the lesser discourse on tactical deployment and the greater discourse on tactical deployment. So I suppose I should read these. And I should say that they both appear to be two versions of pretty much the same sutta, that there's a lot of overlap in these two suttas. And I'm not exactly sure how that came about. I prefer the lesser or the smaller discourse, but the greater discourse has some just classic, just wildly unorthodox verses in it that I'll get to eventually. But I'm going to start with the small discourse on tactical deployment right here. And maybe if I'm being ambitious, I can put up some text, use some graphics in this video and show you the text. I put Pali on one side and English on the other, partly just because I figured that the English translation is so radically unorthodox Theravada Buddhism. I mean, it's pre-Theravada Buddhism, that people might doubt my skills as a translator. So I included the Pali so I can just say, see, it says it here in Pali. And I suppose also before I start on reading the lesser discourse or the small discourse on tactical deployment, I'll go back to Appendix 1 of this version of the book. And this is not found in the, well, maybe it is. Just a second, I gotta make sure about this. Okay, so it's not found in the earlier translations. This is like a special edition to the Path Press edition. It's a little thing that I wrote. Some evidence suggesting the great antiquity of the Atthakavagga. And I'm saying that the Attakawagga is probably the largest chunk of pre-Theravada Buddhism, of just archaic, primitive Buddhism in existence. That this is potentially the most important Buddhist document in existence. Not just my translation, I mean the original Pali, or even in a way it's like Proto-Pali. But I'll get to that. So, some evidence suggesting the great antiquity of the Attica Wagga. 1. The language of the Attica Wagga contains several rare and archaic grammatical forms reminiscent of Vedic Sanskrit, which are absent in the more streamlined grammar of most of the rest of the canon. So it's so old that it's written in a kind of archaic Pali. Like, for example, the nominative singular sometimes ends in ase instead of a, which is derived from Vedic Sanskrit. And the commentators don't even know what that means. They just say that the se at the end of ase is like a particle that's just thrown in that means like truly or verily or something, but that's not the case. 2. The Attica Wagga is referred to by name elsewhere in the Tipitaka at, for example, Udana 5.6 in the Suttanta Pitaka and Mahavagga 5.13 in the Vinaya Pitaka. Both of these passages tell the story of a young bhikkhu named Sona Kudikana who, when requested by the Buddha to speak some Dhamma, recites the Attica Wagga to the Buddha. The passage in the Udana also correctly specifies that the Atthakavagga has 16 parts. Thus it was already compiled and named before the completion of the works in which the story is found. So, I mean, that in itself indicates that this is older than the completed version of the Udana, and it's older than the completed version of the Vinaya Mahavagga, both of which are canonical core texts. 3. The Atthakavagga is one of the very few portions of the Pali Canon with a line-by-line commentary that is also canonical, namely the Mahanidesa. Interestingly, the purpose of the Mahanidesa is apparently not to expound upon the great profundity of the Atthakavagga as it does more to trivialize than glorify it. Furthermore, the Mahanidesa was probably not composed merely to comment upon a notably ancient text, as at the time of its composition, many suttas were believed to predate the Atthakavagga, yet they are without a canonical commentary. Its most likely purpose seems to be to reinterpret, to explain away a large body of proto-Theravadan or even pre-Theravadan philosophy that was clearly at odds with later doctrinal development, but was nevertheless too well known to be deleted from the canon. In fact, I'm pretty sure one or two suttas, well, at least one sutta of the Atthakavagga was recommended in an edict by Ashoka. It's on one of his pillar edicts or stone edicts as recommended study for Buddhists. And so this book was much better known in ancient India than it is today among Theravada Buddhists. Well, I'll continue. 4. According to the literary evidence, the Atthakavagga, but not the Sutta Pitaka as a whole, was common to many, probably most, and possibly all of the ancient schools of Buddhism, including the Mahasangikas, who are historically the first branch off from the Proto-Theravada Sarvastivada line, being equivalent to the Vajjiputtas in the Pali account of the Second Council. The story of Venerable Sona Kudikana's recitation of the Atthakavagga is also recorded in the Mahasangika Vinaya, as well as in the Vinayas of other ancient schools preserved in the immense Mahayana Tripitaka. And I suppose I should back up to number 3 here. There's something I forgot to mention, in that the commentary, there is an ancient commentary to this Atthakavagga that is also part of the Pali Tipitaka. And there's only one other text only a few other texts that I know of that are so old and were considered so important that their commentary or a commentary to them is also included in the Polytipitaka, that is canonical, not just commentarial literature, but canonical just scripture. And that's the Patimokkha rules for monks and nuns. And also there's another chapter that is approximately as old as the Attica Wagga in the Sutta Nipata, the Parayana Wagga, that there's a commentary to that also. And also there's a commentary to the rhinoceros horn discourse, the Kagawisana Sutta, all of these coming from the Sutta Nipata except for the Patimokkha rules. So that is an indication of great antiquity and also high regard in very early times. That it was considered to be so important that they canonized, or made canonical, a commentary to this. But as I say, I mean, it wasn't to really explain it. It was to try to force fit the later developed orthodoxy onto this just blatantly unorthodox text. In fact, there are some scholars who believe that the Atthakavagga was pre-Buddhist and that it was just so popular that the Buddhists adopted it. And I assume one reason why they're saying it's pre-Buddhist, aside from the fact that it's obviously very old, is that it's just not Orthodox Buddhism, even though it's really old. But I'll continue here. Number 5. The text of the Attica Wagga contains none of the usual stock passages, little of any technical systematization of doctrine, and with the possible exception of the introductory verses of the Magandiya Sutta and the Sariputta Sutta, no fairy tale narratives, all of which are characteristic of later material. And finally, number 6, the teachings of the Attica Wagga are addressed to a sangha of homeless, wandering ascetics and are very simple, often to the point of being enigmatic, yet also exceedingly profound. They appear to come from a time when the sasana was still in a primitive state, most of its converts being veterans to the holy life and being far more inclined to practically realize than to theoretically philosophize. The existence of sedentary bhikkhus living in prosperous monasteries and dedicating their efforts to intellectual investigation of Dhamma, which became the norm very early in the history of Buddhism, is clearly at variance with the spirit of these teachings. So, I go back to the Attica Wagga here and the small discourse on tactical deployment, which is number 12 of the group of 16. And number 13 of the group of 16 is the great discourse on tactical deployment. So, I'll spare you the Pali. And I speak Pali in a strange, it's sort of like an American accent over the top of a Burmese accent, because that's how I learned Pali. So I may put up the Pali for the few of you knowledge geeks who actually can verify the meanings of Pali words. But I will, in the commentary part, I will kind of discuss a little bit of the Pali side of this. So anyway, this is a dialogue. There's like a questioner and the Buddha speaking, and it doesn't really specify, but I'm sure you can figure out from the context, the questions being asked are the person who's asking the Buddha these questions, and then the answers, of course, are the Buddha answering the questions. So, Attica Wagga, number 12, small discourse on tactical deployment. Each abiding in his own view, having taken up a position, adepts make different arguments. He who knows thus has realized the way. Denying this, one is imperfect. And thus, having taken up a position, they contend and say, the other is a fool, not an adept. Which of these is the true argument? Indeed, even all of them are claiming to be adepts. Then the Buddha speaks. If by not consenting to another's philosophy one is a lowly fool of inferior understanding, then even all are fools with quite inferior understanding, even all of those abiding in a view. If by their own view, even though they are not immaculate, they are of purified understanding, adept, possessed of insight, then not one of them is of deficient understanding. Indeed, their views also are in that way consummate. Truly, I do not say, it is so, which fools say contrarily to each other. They have each made out their own view to be true, therefore, indeed, they hold the other to be a fool. What That which some say is true is so, others say is vain, is false, and thus having taken up a position they contend, why do philosophers not declare just one way? There is but one truth, not a second, over which a knowing one would contend with a knowing one. But philosophers call out different truths for themselves, therefore they do not declare just one way. Why do they declare different truths, argumentative, claiming to be adepts? Many different truths are heard, or else they just follow speculation. Indeed, there are not many different perennial truths in the world, except by means of perception. So having contrived a speculation from among the views, they speak of a duality of truth and falsehood. The seen, the heard, morality and observances, and the felt, depending upon these he is disdainful, and standing in his discrimination, scoffing, he says, the other is a fool, not an adept. That very thing by which he holds the other to be a fool, by that he speaks of himself as an adept. He himself, claiming himself to be adept, disdains another while speaking just the same. Just by his excessive view he is consummate, drunk with conceit, considering himself to be complete, by himself consecrated in his own mind. Indeed, that view of his also is in that way consummate. Indeed, if by another's word someone is inferior, then oneself also comes to be of inferior understanding. Then again, if of oneself one is a realizer of truth, a wise man, then among philosophers no one is a fool. Those who proclaim a philosophy other than this have failed at purity and are imperfect. Just so do sectarians severally claim. Indeed, they are impassioned with passion for their own views. Only here is purity. Thus they argue. They say purity is not in other philosophies. Just so are sectarians severally entrenched, steadfastly proclaiming there their own method. But steadfastly proclaiming his own method, what other person here should he hold to be the fool? Even he himself would bring about the conflict, declaring the other to be a fool with an impure philosophy. Standing in discrimination, having measured himself up, he comes to further contention in the world. But having left behind all discriminations, a person makes no conflict in the world. And that is the end of the small discourse on tactical deployment. And if you're familiar with Theravada Buddhism at all, you should realize that this is not teaching Theravada Buddhism. Theravada Buddhism is a philosophical system, and this is rejecting philosophical systems. So I'll try and go over here. Adept is kusala. So it's like in Pali, instead of good and evil, usually it's referring to kusala and akusala, which means skillful or unskillful. But a person who is called kusala as a noun, that person is a kusala. They're like completely skillful. They are adept. So I translate it as adept. Let's see. If not consenting to others' philosophy. Yeah, this is a standard. It's a basic argument. This part where it's mentioned twice in this sutta, and it's also mentioned in the next version of the approximately the same sutta. Is that if you're considered if somebody being considered wrong makes them wrong, then everyone's wrong because somebody is going to consider anybody to be wrong. But if you consider yourself to be right, that doesn't make you right either. So, just setting aside the opinions of the masses and all that, that's like basic. You have to do that for starters. So let's see. And this one is this verse that I'm going to read again is really just it's kind of a mind blower. It's the Buddha here saying, "Truly, I do not say it is so, which fools say contrarily to each other. They have each made out their own view to be true, therefore indeed they hold the other to be a fool." So that's the Buddha saying that he doesn't make assertions. He just did by saying, "I do not say it is so." But with regard to philosophies, he's not putting out a philosophical system. For him, it's more practice. Early Buddhism, it was not a philosophical system. It was you're avoiding philosophies. And I should mention that in this sutta, and the one that follows, when I say philosophy, it's the original Pali word is Dhamma. But And the word that I say philosopher, when I mention philosophers, that's samana. So it's I mean, some people would argue, I should have just used the word Dhamma, but it seems pretty obvious from the context that they're referring to like philosophical systems. And in a way, Dhamma, it eventually became a philosophical system anyway. So let's see, yeah, like why do philosophers not declare just one way? The original Pali is samana. So um, in ancient India, there's the standard pairing of samanas and brahmanas, which I usually translate as like philosophers and priests. The Brahmins were the Brahmin caste, like proto-Hindu, what became Hinduism in later centuries. And the Samanas were like the non-Hindu ascetics, mostly ascetics. And mostly the Samanas would shave their heads or just pluck it out by the roots like the Jains did. So let's see. There is but one truth, not a second, over which a knowing one would contend with a knowing one. But you can't turn it into a philosophical system. Once you express it in words which are perceptual, you've lost it already. And that is like one of the basic messages of the Attica Wagga is that thoughts are not it. You're not going to understand reality by thinking about it. You're not going to understand true Dhamma by thinking about it. That it's just beyond thought. You experience it directly. Let's see. And right here, it's like, indeed, there are not many different perennial truths in the world except by means of perception. And in fact, in some early versions of Paticca Samuppada or dependent co-arising, the whole system of samsara starts with perception, which is one reason why I have formulated the motto that perception is samsara. Once you symbolize things, you're not dealing with reality anymore. You're dealing with symbols, which are just something that's supposed to represent something else, but you're not dealing with reality directly anymore. So indeed, there are not many different perennial truths in the world except by means of perception. So having contrived a speculation from among the views, they speak of a duality of truth and falsehood. And then there's what follows, the next verse after that is just a common refrain throughout the Atthakavagga. The seen, the heard, morality and observances, and the felt. Depending upon these, he is disdainful. And standing in his discrimination, scoffing, he says, the other is a fool, not an adept. With this first line, the seen, the heard, morality and observances, and the felt, that's the things that you're not supposed to rely upon. So the seen is things that you have viewed, essentially. You've seen it with your own eyes out there in the world. The heard mainly is what you have learned. Someone has taught you this. Well, nowadays you maybe read it in a book or saw it on a YouTube video, but they didn't have books or YouTube videos in ancient India, obviously. Next is morality and observances, or sila bhatta, and that got reinterpreted by the commentarial tradition. That sila bhatta, or I interpret it literally as morality and observances. The commentaries say what it means is like really ridiculous stuff, like imitating cows or dogs. Just crawling around naked on all fours and acting like a dog. And there were some ascetics who did that in ancient India, but obviously it goes way beyond that. And then the felt, which is probably more along the lines of internal, like intuitive kind of stuff, that you're not supposed to rely on any of that. You're not supposed to rely on outward systems, not supposed to rely on what you've seen in the world, what you have heard. It just goes completely beyond that, because all of this stuff is perceptual at best. It's just symbols. It's symbols concocted in your mind. So let's see here. Again, here, like at verse 13, it repeats, indeed, if by another's word someone is inferior, then oneself also becomes to be of inferior understanding. Then again, if of oneself one is a realizer of truth, a wise man, then among philosophers no one is a fool. And again, philosopher is a samana. So, I mean, it's kind of dispensing with the whole idea of, I know that I'm true, therefore I'm right. Or, everyone else thinks I'm right, therefore I'm right. Both of those are just shot down. So let's see. Uh, so the very final verse of the sutta is standing in discrimination, having measured himself up, he comes to further contention in the world, having left behind all discriminations. And discrimination is vinichya. A person makes no conflict in the world. So one of the messages of this is if you believe in something, you believe in some system, of course, you're going to consider other systems to be wrong, and then you're going to get sucked into, just all kinds of wrangling and stuff that really is not conducive to enlightenment. You're just wallowing in samsara at that point. And I have to admit, I, I like debates and arguments and so forth myself. There's another sutta in the Atthakavagga called the Pasura Sutta, which is full of military jargon, and it's just about the foolishness of debating. Even though I'm willing to debate people, I have to admit. So I'm going to move on to the great discourse on tactical deployment, which is Sutta number 13 of the 16 Sutta Attica And you'll notice that there's a lot of similarity, and I do think that these are like two versions of the same sutta. But this one goes a little farther in certain respects. It gets even more wildly unorthodox. So again, it's well, I mean, this one maybe isn't even. I think they kind of did away with the questioner in this sutta. Whichever of these abiding in a view contend, saying only this is true, even all of them incur censure, but they also get praise therein. Yet it is only a little, not enough to be equable. I tell you of the two fruits of contention. So having seen this, one should not contend, regarding as sanctuary the ground of non-contention. Whatever common conventions there are, an experienced one does not have recourse to any of them. How would he without recourse come to have recourse when not making submission to the seen and the heard? Those who think morality is supreme say purity is by self-restraint. Having taken upon themselves an observance, they are dedicated to it. Let us train ourselves. Let us train ourselves right here and now, and then there would be purity. Claiming to be adepts, they are brought up to further existence. If he has fallen away from his morality and observances, he is agitated, having failed in his action. He longs for and aspires to pure freedom from wrong, like one who has lost his caravan and is far from home. But having abandoned all morality and observances, and that action that is criticized or uncriticized, not aspiring to purity or non-purity, he would live refraining, not taking hold even of peace. Depending upon ignorant darkness, or upon something being shunned in aversion, or then again upon the seen, the heard, or the felt, in their going on they cry for purity, with craving not gone for this or that existence. Indeed, for one aspiring, there are things longed for, and also there is agitation among contrived conceptions. But he for whom there is no falling away or arising here, why would he be agitated, and what would he long for? That very philosophy, which some say is ultimate, others say is deficient. Which of these is the true argument? Indeed, even all of them are claiming to be adepts. Indeed, they say their own philosophy is complete, while they say the philosophy of another is deficient, and thus having taken up a position they contend, each saying his own convention is the truth. If by being scorned by another one were deficient, then among philosophies none would be outstanding. Indeed, they severally claim the other's philosophy to be inferior, while steadfastly proclaiming their own. And just as they praise their own methods, even so is their veneration of their own philosophies. Even all arguments would be correct. Indeed, their purity is only subjective. For the holy man there is nothing outward which would lead him, seized, having discriminated from among the philosophies. Thus he has transcended contentions. Indeed, he sees no extraneous philosophy to be preeminent. I see, I understand. It is just like this. Some rely on purity by view. If one has viewed something, what indeed has one got by it? Having overshot, they argue that purity is by something extraneous. Seeing, a man views name and form, and having viewed, he will understand just those. Let him see much or little, as he desires. Adept ones say, Purity is indeed not by that. Indeed, not easy to guide is a dogmatist who is setting before him a contrived view. Claiming the good to be there and what he is dependent upon, he is a proclaimer of purity who has seen reality there. Not conceiving, the holy man has no recourse to any designation. He is neither a follower of views nor an adherent of knowledge, and he, having known the common conventions, looks on indifferently while others take them up. The sage, having let loose his ties here in the world, is not a partisan among contentions that have arisen. Peaceful among those who are not at peace, he is an indifferent onlooker, not taking hold of things while others take them up. Having left behind former encumbering influences and not working up new ones, he does not go by inclination, nor is he a dogmatist. He, a wise one, is freed of beliefs. He is not mired in the world, and he does not reproach himself. He has become at peace among all philosophies, and toward whatever is seen or heard or felt. He, a sage, has put down his burden and is freed, not conceiving, not desisting, not aspiring. And that's the end of the great discourse on tactical deployment, or the Viyuha Sutta. And you may have noticed that this is even more radically non-Theravadan than the small discourse. It goes a little farther. And in fact, some scholars have called the Attica Wagga in general, or at least some parts of it, to be proto-Majjhimaka, because this comes closer to some teachings of Mahayana Buddhism than it does to orthodox Theravada Buddhism. So it starts off with what is discussed in the Pasura Sutta also, about how if you get into arguments or debates, I mean, if you win, it's kind of a shabby kind of happiness you get from it, and if you lose, then you're all upset because you lost. Let's see. Whatever common conventions they are, and the term for common convention here. Second here. The term for common convention here is Samudi, which is like in conventional truth, you've got the two truths in Buddhism. You've got ultimate truth, or paramata satcha, and then you've got conventional truth, or samuti satcha. The word samuti is used here for common conventions, and it's just what people believe. It's not really ultimately true. So whatever common conventions there are, an experienced one does not have a recourse to any of them, which means, I mean, you can speak in terms of that for the sake of communicating with other humans in samsara, but you don't really believe it. You certainly don't cling to it. How would he without recourse come to have recourse when not making submission to the seen and the heard? And again, the seen and the heard is what you know through direct personal empirical experience, or what you have learned from teachers or whatever. Let's see. And the recourse here is upeka, which I think in Mahayana Buddhism, the Sanskrit version of that is usually interpreted in English as skillful means, but here it just means, like, recourse, something that you rely on. And then we got this interesting part where the Buddha is essentially bashing morality. And I mean, he's not bashing morality in and of itself. He's bashing the very idea that you're going to get enlightened through morality, which was just, I mean, the Theravada Buddhists just took this and ran with it. I mean, you have to be an absolute perfect saint in order to become enlightened. And in the recent Q&A, there was a question about this sort of thing. And I kind of side with the Krishnamurti types, where they're saying, it may help you. I mean, it increases your odds to be saintly, but it's not going to get you enlightened in and of itself. So those who think morality is supreme say purity is by self-restraint. Having taken upon themselves an observance, they are dedicated to us. And then, let's see, claiming to be adepts, they are brought up to further existence. Because if you're clinging to this set of rules or whatever, you're still clinging. And that's keeping you in samsara. You're clinging to samsara because rules are samsaric. And then I mentioned that there are a lot of puns, and there's a pun in this next verse here. If he has fallen away from his morality and observances, he is agitated, having failed in his action. He longs for and aspires to pure freedom from wrong, like one who has lost his caravan and is far from home. What I translated as freedom from wrong or pure freedom from wrong is sudim, or sudi, which usually is translated as purity, but like etymologically, the word sudi or suda, it means well placement. So here it's referring to, the guy who's lost his caravan, he wants security. So sudi can usually means purity in Buddhist philosophy, but here it means something more like security, but it's the same word. So it's kind of a play on words here. The man who's lost his caravan wants sudi, which in this case doesn't mean purity like it usually does, but it means just security, safety. And I mean, this verse, I mean, it's echoing what J. Krishnamurti talks about. How Krishnamurti would say, if you try to live up to some ideal or try to follow this moral code, then I mean, you're just setting yourself up for failure and hypocrisy. And later on, not much later on, Theravada Buddhism became essentially a monastic system that, I mean, it was largely based on Vinaya rules. That to be a monk, you have to follow Vinaya rules. Just to become a monk in the first place, you have to do it in accordance with Vinaya. And even if you drop out, you have to do that in accordance with Vinaya. But there are indications that originally there was no Vinaya. Like even in the texts themselves, the Buddha, and there's supposedly it was like 20 years before the Buddha started laying down rules of discipline. And also, there's another place where some monk is asking the Buddha, why did previous Buddhas, why did the Buddhism that they started, the sasana that they started, why didn't it last very long? And the Buddha said it's because they didn't have rules of monastic discipline. So it died out pretty quickly. And I mean, there is truth to that. I mean, when the charismatic founder of a system is no longer in this world, if you don't have any kind of established system that's lending stability to it, it's going to fall apart pretty quickly. But on the other hand, if you do set up this established system, you wind up with, dogmatic adherence to rules and rituals and so forth, it runs pretty much rampant in Buddhism, in Theravada Buddhism in particular. Although I have to admit, most monks really don't even try to follow the rules strictly. They're just following along with tradition, which is even worse, I suppose. So let's see. Oh, and then you get even wilder with the next verse. But having abandoned all morality and observances, all sila and vata, and that action that is criticized or uncriticized, so that's pretty much all actions, not aspiring to purity or impurity, he would live refraining, not taking hold even of peace. So whatever's happening, I mean, that's just nature taking its course, and you just don't identify with it. You don't cling to it. You don't, you don't just say this is mine. You just let it take its course, and you just stand back and observe at most. So then the next verse, depending upon ignorant darkness or upon something being shunned in aversion, or then again upon the seen, the heard, or the felt, in their going on, they cry for purity, with craving not gone for this or that existence. And even wanting to be pure, you're wanting just to kind of refine samsara. But this, depending upon ignorant darkness, I interpreted that to mean like cultivating trance states, like meditative trance states, where you're just like, I mean, you're almost like in a coma. You're like a hibernating squirrel or some such. And then all morality and observances again. I mean, so it's not that you just abandon morality. It's just that you do. I mean, you're moral, but you're not like clinging to it and thinking I have to follow this rule. I have to do this. I have to do that because it's like an anchor in samsara. It's just getting you stuck, more stuck than before. So I'm just kind of going through these verses, trying to find something wild to comment upon here. And again, it has the same argument here. If by being scorned by another one were deficient, then among philosophies none would be outstanding. Indeed, they severally claim the other's philosophy to be inferior, while steadfastly proclaiming their own. And this deficient, the term deficient is hino, which is like in hinayana. It's a past participle of hyadi, which means to dwindle away, to lose. So as an adjective, it means like deficient. Something is missing. It is lacking. So when the Mahayana Buddhists started calling the older schools of Buddhism Hinayana, they're essentially, it's a slur. They're calling them the deficient vehicle. Let's see. Yeah, their purity is only subjective. Yeah. Because, I mean, true purity, I mean, it's not perceptual. It's not something you can grasp with your mind. I mean, reality is pure, but you can't grasp reality with a thinking mind because it deals entirely in symbols. So, for the holy man, there is nothing outward which would lead him, seized, having discriminated from among the philosophies. Thus he has transcended contentions. Indeed, he sees no extraneous philosophy to be preeminent. And this nothing outward and this extraneous, that's even referring to one's own thoughts. In the Attica Wagga, like, the external world obviously is external, but even your own thoughts are considered to be external. And that's because if there's any true essence to you at all, which you can't talk about, because once you talk about it, you turn it into something samsaric and illusory, essentially. But even your own thoughts are not you. They are just extraneous to the essence, if you can even say there is an essence. I mean, Buddhism just kind of leaves that moot, or at least early Buddhism did, because once you start talking about it, you've already missed the boat. You've already lost. Especially if you got some jokers, some clowns. They'll just be talking about like how the Buddha really taught that there's a self, and they're just insisting and pounding away and insisting, and they're just stuck, just in accordance with this text. So let's see here. I understand, I see, it is just like this. Some rely on purity by view. If one has viewed something, what indeed has one got by it? Having overshot, they argue that purity is by something extraneous. And that also is a recurring theme in the Atthakavagga, that any kind of belief that you have is extraneous because even your own thoughts are extraneous. That you're not going to reach purity by adding something on to what you've already got. It's like if you're going for purity, you're just trying to empty yourself. You're not trying to take on this philosophical system that's somehow going to just erase all impurity, when actually the philosophical system is itself a kind of impurity. It might be skillful means, it might be the raft made of rubbish that you used to cross the flood. But when you cross the flood, you let go of it. You don't just cling to it as though this is the only truth. One of the standard examples of a fool in the Pali text, just like a stereotype, is the person who says, only this is true, anything else is wrong. And the commentaries, I mean, when they're interpreting this stuff, like in the Mahanidesa and just later commentarial tradition also, they're just saying, well, that's just referring to people with wrong view. When it says don't have any view, they mean don't have any wrong view. When it says don't have any beliefs, they say it means don't have any wrong beliefs. But I mean, why would the Buddha even tell people don't believe what's wrong? It's not very likely. So even the views or philosophical views, which are dhammas in the Pali, it's something extraneous. I mean, it's not the goal. At best, it's a means to the goal. And again, this is like proto Mahayana. And then this next one is interesting. Seeing, a man views name and form, and having viewed, he will understand just those. Let him see much or little as he desires. Adept ones say purity is indeed not by that. And this name and form is Namarupa. So in the original Pali, it's Pasam Naro Dakadi Namarupa. And probably, it seems to me, just based on the context here, that this is going with an older interpretation of Namarupa. In established Theravada Buddhism, Namarupa is mind and matter. Nama is mind, Rupa is matter, but literally, Nama is name. It has the same etymology as the English word name, this going back into Proto-Indo-European, and Rupa is form. So, seeing, a man views name and form. It seems to me that he's not viewing mind and matter. He's just viewing like a samsaric world, so that you see the rupa, the form of something, and then you attach a name to it. You attach significance to that. That's how perception works. You start off with a kind of raw datum, and then you have to single that out and attribute some kind of meaning to it. Even if it's, what is that? It's still a that. It's still something. But already you're working in symbols in your mind. So let's see. Indeed, not easy to guide is a dogmatist who is setting before him a contrived view. Claiming the good to be there in what he is dependent upon, he is a proclaimer of purity who has seen reality there. And a dogmatist is nivisa vadi. Nivisa just means like entrenched, and vadi is a speaker. Like an entrenched speaker is a dogmatist, someone who's just stuck in this system. And I'm sure you've met lots of them of just about any religion. It's just only this is true. And they don't even really know that it's true. They just want to believe. It says it in the book. The book is divine. The book was taught by an enlightened being, whatever. And so they use that as an excuse to just vehemently cling to this group of words and ideas that they then parrot and assume that they're right. And there's Theravada Buddhists are no different, especially if you go to like Burma, where most monks really are well educated. Most monks are scholars, and they're dogmatists. It's just they learn through rote memorization. They are incapable of questioning the authenticity of anything. Not even the commentarial tradition, medieval commentaries, even early modern sub-commentaries. They can't question any of it. It all has to be true, and it's just they're going against some of the earliest Buddhist teachings in existence. Let's see here. Not conceiving, the holy man has no recourse to any designation. He is neither a follower of views nor an adherent of knowledge. And he, having known the common conventions, again, Samudi, looks on indifferently while others take them up. So conceiving, it's kapadi. The verb is kapadi, and it's found throughout the Attica Wagga. It's essentially the same word without the prefix as sankappa or sama sankappa in the Eightfold Path, which is usually translated as right thought or right mental action, right attitude. So kappa, it just means like to perceive, to think, to cogitate. And the holy man has no recourse to any designation. And the term for designation here is sankha or sankham. He has no recourse to any designation, which is like no this or that, no discrete perceived entities. He's not clinging to any of that. He is neither a follower of views nor an adherent of knowledge. And the original Pali is not diti sari napi jnana bandhu. So bandhu literally means like a kinsman. He is not a kinsman of knowledge. And here the knowledge is like intellectual knowledge, because that's not the way you understand reality. And he, having known the common conventions, again, samuti or samutio, looks on indifferently while others take them up. And to look on indifferently, the verb is upekati, which is the same root as the word upeka, which is usually translated as equanimity. But literally, upeka just means to look on. Like upa means sort of up to, and the pek, or the ka part, the ka, is to see, or to look. So you're just sort of observing, you're not getting involved. So the sage, having let loose his ties here in the world, is not a partisan among contentions that have arisen. Peaceful among those who are not at peace, he is an indifferent onlooker, not taking hold of things while others take them up. So again, it's the upekati. Yeah, upekako is the word there for being an indifferent onlooker, just looking on and not getting involved. It's just nature taking its course at most. So this next one, having left behind former encumbering influences and not working up new ones, he does not go by inclination, nor is he a dogmatist. He, a wise one, is freed of beliefs. He is not mired in the world, and he does not reproach himself. So again, this comes closer to the teachings of J. Krishnamurti than it comes to the teachings of Buddhaghosa. But let's see, encumbering influences is asawa. And that's an interesting term. It's a term used a lot, the asawas. Originally there were 3, and then a 4th one got added. And it's usually translated as taint. I think Bhikkhu Bodhi translates it as taint or canker. There's lots of different terms for it, corruptions, so forth. I I translated it as encumbering influence, which is kind of a cumbrous translation, but that's essentially what it means. Asawa, according to Ajahn Thanisaro, it's a word that was borrowed from the Jains. And the Jains considered karma, or kamma in Pali, to be almost like essentially a material substance that flows in and like sticks to your soul or your jiva and holds you down so that you can't float up into heaven. And so the Jains, like their entire system is trying to get rid of this sticky karma that's sticking to their soul, and they would try to accelerate that, not just letting their karma work itself out naturally, but they would be literally torturing themselves. But asawa, it's a prefix and then the root. The root comes from sawadi, which means to flow, and the means towards yourself. So it's something that flows towards you, and it's an influence. But it's not just an influence, it's an encumbering influence. It's something that like weighs you down. So they've left behind former encumbering influences and not working up new ones. He does not go by inclination, nor is he a dogmatist. And there's an interesting sutta, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of it. It's in the Majjhima Nikaya. It's not even attributed to the Buddha himself. It's attributed to Ananda, if I remember correctly, where Ananda is telling a non-Buddhist philosopher about how if you follow your own ideas, then you're going to be right some of the time and wrong some of the time. And if you follow an established tradition, well, the established tradition is going to be right some of the time and wrong some of the time. And so it's like both alternatives, working out the truth for yourself or relying upon somebody else for the truth. Both of them are, I mean, neither one of them works. And that's what it's saying here, essentially. He does not go by inclination, nor is he a dogmatist. And the inclination here is chanda, which usually is translated like desire. So he, a wise one, is freed of beliefs, or let's see, where is it? Diti. Yeah, so the word I translated as beliefs here is diti gada, which is like arriving at a view. And again, in the commentaries, it says, well, it just means wrong beliefs. But that's not what it says. It just says any diti, any view. If you've gone to any view, you're not, I mean, that's not it. You're off the path, essentially. And then he is not mired in the world, and he does not reproach himself. And in the Attica Wagga, it's a common theme. Another common theme is comparing the sage to a lotus flower that has emerged from the water. It's growing out of mud, but notoriously, or famously, I should say, mud and water just do not stick to a lotus flower. I mean, it's got like this waxy coating on it. It's like non-stick. And the enlightened sage is like that. Nothing sticks to him. It's like he's just independent. And so finally, the last verse, he has become at peace among all philosophies and toward whatever is seen or heard or felt. He, a sage, has put down his burden and is freed, not conceiving, not desisting, not aspiring. So this becoming at peace is an interesting word. It's he has become at peace is viseni bhutto. So the word sena or seni means having an army. We is not having an army, and bhutto means having become. So he has come without an army. He has come to be without an army, which means, he's at peace. He's not fighting, he's not struggling, he's not in conflict. So he is at peace among all philosophies, and again, whatever is seen or heard or felt. So that's ditam, suttam, and muttam. Sometimes muttam is interpreted as any of the senses beyond the seeing and the hearing, but here it's like something internal. It's like more intuitive than like empirical knowledge from what you've seen from your own experience, what you have learned from teachers and so forth, secondhand, or else just what is like arises internally. And that includes knowledge. It's like any kind of intellectual philosophical knowledge, again, is strongly discouraged in this book, even though later Buddhism just ran with it. They just started wallowing in it. Which is one reason why Mahayana arose, because the older schools were developing Abhidhamma philosophies and getting very systematic and trying to systematize everything and have everything explained in this rigorous and rigid system that's all in their head, just intellectual. And that's clearly not what the Buddha was teaching originally, at least if we consider this to be an indication of what the Buddha was teaching originally. And again, it is very old text. So he, a sage, has put down his burden and is freed, not conceiving, not desisting, not aspiring. So the conceiving again is kapio, desisting is uparato, and aspiring is patio. So he's not like cooking up any kind of systems. He's not avoiding necessarily anything either. You know, he's not trying to get freed by avoiding. He's not trying to get freed by accumulating. You know, nothing is taken up, nothing is laid down, which is a very common statement in the Atthakavagga, even though it's not included in these two suttas. And again, it was a pun because I mean, there's different ways of interpreting it, but it's pretty obvious that it was all that both meanings were deliberate. But I can get into that some other time, I suppose. And not aspiring is it's like he's not aiming towards a specific goal, because that goal is in his head, and thus it is samsaric. You know, it's just more conception. It's just more extraneous mental verbiage. It's just another encumbering influence. So I hope I succeeded to some degree in pointing out that one of the earliest Buddhist texts, which is found in the Pali Tipitaka, and in fact its commentary is found in the Pali Tipitaka, is obviously not Theravada Buddhist. And the early commentators, including the authors of the Mahanidesa, the canonical commentary, they were just doing everything they could to try to force fit these texts into like established orthodox dogma, and it doesn't work. And that's one reason why the Mahanidesa it almost became extinct. It's one of the reasons why they finally decided to write down the Pali texts after 500 years, is that there were times when Buddhism was being persecuted in southern India and in Sri Lanka also. And at one point, there was only one monk left alive who had memorized the whole thing. And so that was one reason why they figured we better write this stuff down just in case it gets lost. But although I have to admit, if the Mahanidesa were lost, it would not be a great loss. I mean, I don't know if the Pali Text Society has ever bothered to translate it into English. I was using it as a kind of guide while translating this. I was continually referring to the Mahanidesa, but it's clearly a late text. Like it mentions Greeks, for example. And yeah, I mean, it's a Theravadan attempt to Theravadize the Attica and this is not orthodox Theravada Buddhism. So if you want to know what the earliest Buddhism was like, what the Buddha originally taught, you would do well to study this book, not necessarily my translation, although I do think my translation is possibly the best. It's among the top ones. I've been told that by a number of people. I would like someday to have this thing published again in a smaller format, like I said, where you can just carry it in your pocket and just pull it out when you're sitting in a park and read it there. But no, I just lost what I was saying. But I do hope that you can get some idea of what the earliest Buddhism was like, that it wasn't just plain Theravada, or that it wasn't Buddhagosism. Buddhism and Buddhagosism are significantly different, not in all respects, but Theravada Buddhism definitely just got the idea of having a right view as some sort of philosophical system that is like correct. You know, like just about any other religious system, like Christianity, for example. And originally Buddhism was not like that. And it wasn't just skepticism. Some people accused the Buddha of being a skeptic because he wouldn't, you know, you couldn't nail him down on certain things. You know, even in Theravada, you know, the established tradition, you know, the dogmatic tradition, there are certain questions he just wouldn't answer. And it wasn't because he didn't know, or it wasn't just because he was a skeptic. It was because that all of this thinking is not the way to become enlightened. You're never going to become enlightened by thinking about it. You can never contain reality in thoughts, no matter how elegant or sophisticated the system is. It's never going to get one iota closer to the truth. And Immanuel Kant said the same thing about science. He said that science, no matter how advanced it gets, it's never going to come 1 inch closer to the thing in itself or ultimate reality. And the Buddha had insight into that a long time ago. And a lot of people nowadays just don't get it. You know, especially Asians and a lot of faith-oriented Western Buddhists, they just want to believe, they want to believe in the texts, and it's all what the Buddha taught, or at least, certain texts, the core text is all what the Buddha taught. And I'm sorry to say that it's not true. And this book, the Atthakavagga, not my translation of it, but I think the earliest translation the first translation that I read was from Max Muller's Sacred Texts of the East series, and I think it was a fellow named Fausbowl who translated this in the late 1800s. But this was like my Bible as a monk. It still is pretty much my Bible. And, it's one of the main things that allowed me to stay a monk for 30 years, because there's a lot of stuff in the Theravada Pali texts that I just could not believe. I just could not take it seriously. The entire third Pitaka, for example, the Abhidhamma, I just could not believe it. And just all these stories and so forth. And then I could just fall back on this, which says, don't believe anything. And that's, it's damn difficult to do, because so long as we're unenlightened, we have to believe something. But at least knowing that you shouldn't believe anything, it causes you to grip it a little less tightly, which is good, because then you can let go of it when the time comes more easily. So we've been at this for over an hour, so I think I'll just call it good, and maybe if there's a call for it, I can go through some of the other suttas. I think I already have gone through a few of the early ones, or like the first shorter ones. They gradually get longer as you go through the Attica Wagga. So that's it, and be happy.